I watched my friend fall to his death, then come back to life. Hello, Reddit. It's been a few years since this happened, but it's a story that's stuck with me and my friends ever since. I want to start by saying that everyone involved is fine. No one was hurt, and life has moved on. But what we saw, what we experienced, still haunts us to this day. It's one of those things you just can't explain, no matter how much you try to rationalize it. And before I begin, I want to apologize for any mistakes. English isn't my first language, but I'll do my best to get this across clearly. So this all happened back when I was a teenager, around 15 or 16. Every summer, my family and I would travel to Croatia to visit relatives. We had a small house near Makarska, a coastal town surrounded by mountains. For me, those summers were the highlight of the year. I'd always look forward to seeing my cousins and hanging out with the local kids. We'd spend the long, hot days swimming, exploring, and getting into the kind of trouble you only find in small villages where everyone knows everyone. There was a tradition in our group of friends, one that went back as far as any of us could remember. Every summer, we'd hike up into the mountains behind the village. It wasn't a particularly dangerous hike, but it was steep, and there were parts where you had to be careful. The trail led to an abandoned shepherd's house, an old stone building that had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. The local kids would make the trip every year, sometimes more than once, and we'd spend the afternoon exploring the ruins, telling stories and feeling like we were kings of the world with the entire valley spread out below us. I remember that particular day, starting out just like any other. It was late August, one of those days where the sun beats down relentlessly and the air smells like salt and pine trees. 3 of my best friends, M15, M14, and M15, and I decided to make the trip up to the house again, one last adventure before the summer ended. We'd done the hike plenty of times before and knew the trail like the back of our hands. We packed a few snacks and bottles of water, threw on our backpacks, and set off in the late morning, eager to escape the heat and do something exciting. On our way out of the village, we passed by the house of another friend, Ivica, M15. He was sitting out on the terrace drinking a soda, and we called up to him, asking if he wanted to join us. Ivica was always the kind of guy who was up for anything, never one to miss out on an adventure, so it didn't take much convincing before he was grabbing his shoes and running down to meet us. The 5 of us set off together, joking around, talking about what we'd do once we reached the top. Ivica and I had been friends for as long as I could remember, and he'd always been the most fearless out of the group, so it felt natural for him to come along. The hike started out like normal. We made our way up the familiar path, the sun filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The higher we climbed, the cooler the air became, and we could hear the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. It was peaceful. There was nothing out of the ordinary at all. We were laughing, talking about what we were going to do after summer ended, and arguing about who could run up the trail the fastest. But then we got to the part of the hike that always made me a little uneasy. The cliff. It wasn't exactly a cliff, more like a deep ravine or a crack in the mountain that you had to edge around. The path narrowed, and for a few meters you had to walk carefully with the drop just a few feet away. If you fell, you'd tumble down into a rocky gorge, about 20 feet below, littered with boulders. It wasn't deadly, at least not if you were careful, but it would hurt like hell if you slipped. I don't know why, but every time we reached that part of the hike, I felt this prickling at the back of my neck. I always told myself it was just because I wasn't great with heights. But now, thinking back, I wonder if it was something more. If somehow I knew what was going to happen. We slowed down when we got to the ravine, like we always did. No one wanted to rush it. M15 went first, moving carefully along the narrow path, followed by M14. I was behind them, with Ivica and the other M15 bringing up the rear. For the first few steps, everything was fine. We were joking around, making stupid comments to try and lighten the mood, and talking about how the last time we were here, M14 had almost slipped. And then, it happened. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of that scream. One moment, everything was normal, the usual laughter and the sounds of our footsteps on the gravel path. And the next, Ivica screamed. Not just any scream either. It was this guttural, raw, heart-wrenching scream, the kind of sound you don't think a human being can make. A scream of pure terror, the kind that goes right through you and lodges itself deep in your bones. We all whipped around at the same time, just in time to see him fall. It's hard to describe what that moment was like. Everything seemed to slow down. I remember seeing Ivica's face, his eyes wide in horror, his arms flailing as he tried to grab onto something, anything, to stop his fall. But there was nothing to grab. He was too far back on the trail, and the cliffside was too steep. He tumbled over the edge and fell, his body bouncing off the rocks, hitting the boulders below with a sickening thud. The scream stopped, and everything went quiet. For a second, none of us moved. It was like we were frozen, our brains trying to catch up with what had just happened. I couldn't process it. 1 minute, Ivica had been right behind me, and the next, he was lying at the bottom of a ravine, completely still. The silence after his scream was almost worse than the scream itself. It was like the whole world had paused, like even the wind and the birds had stopped moving. We ran to the edge, but it was no use. Ivica wasn't moving. The fall had been too far, the impact too hard. There was no way to climb down and get to him, not without risking one of us falling too. And even if we could, I knew it was already too late. I don't remember who started running first, but suddenly we were all bolting back down the trail, faster than we'd ever run in our lives. We were crying, screaming for help. The image of Ivica's body at the bottom of that ravine burned into our minds. At that moment, it felt like we were running away from the worst thing we'd ever seen. But what we saw when we reached the village, that's when things stopped making sense. We ran faster than I ever thought we could. My legs burned, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. But none of that mattered. We were sprinting, practically tumbling down the mountain, desperate to get back to the village. Every time I blinked, I saw Ivica's body lying at the bottom of that ravine. His scream still echoed in my ears, that raw, terrible sound that I never thought I'd hear from anyone, let alone my friend. As we got closer to the village, I could see the rooftops peeking out through the trees. My heart pounded harder, not from the running, but from the realization of what we were about to do. We had to tell his parents. They were going to find out that their son was dead. I wasn't ready to face that. None of us were. The village was quiet in the midday heat, the usual sounds of summer siesta settling over the streets. As we turned the final corner and the first few houses came into view, I could feel the tears in my eyes. I was about to start yelling for help, calling for the adults, when something stopped me in my tracks. There, standing in front of his house, was Ivica. He was standing on the front porch with his parents, casually talking, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just fallen to his death a few minutes ago. My breath caught in my throat, and I skidded to a stop so fast I nearly fell. The others crashed into me from behind, and we all stood there, staring. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible. We had just seen him fall. We heard his scream. We watched him hit the rocks below. But there he was, completely fine. Not a scratch on him. Ivica must have seen us because he turned toward us, a look of confusion crossing his face. He stepped forward, waving, like he didn't understand why we were standing there frozen. His parents noticed us too and came over, concerned by how pale and panicked we looked. I could see it in their eyes. They knew something was wrong, but they had no idea what. "What's wrong with you guys?" Ivica asked, his voice as normal as ever. It was him, there was no mistaking it. The same voice, the same look, the same everything. We were all panting, out of breath from the run and from the shock, unable to find the words. How do you tell someone you just saw them die? How do you explain that you watched your best friend fall off a cliff, only to find them standing in front of you as if nothing had happened? M15, who had been with us at the back of the group, was the first to speak. "Ivica, we thought you fell," he stammered, his voice shaking. "We saw you fall. You screamed. You were dead. Ivica frowned, clearly not understanding. What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time. His parents exchanged confused glances, and Ivica's mom stepped forward, her face full of concern. What happened? She asked, her voice soft but firm. Why are you boys so upset? I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled and frantic. We went up the mountain and we saw Ivica fall. He fell off the cliff down into the ravine. We couldn't get to him. We thought he was dead. At first, his parents looked confused, but when they saw the terror on our faces, I could see their expressions shift from confusion to genuine concern. They knew us. They knew we weren't the kind of kids to make up stories, especially not about something like this. We weren't pranksters or liars, and the way we were standing there, pale and shaking, was enough to make anyone realize we had seen something terrible. Ivica, though, just shook his head. I don't know what you guys are talking about. I've been with my parents all day. We went to the market this morning. I haven't even been near the mountain. My head was spinning. I couldn't make sense of it. I knew what I had seen. We all knew what we saw. That scream. The fall. It wasn't something you could imagine. It was too real. Too vivid. And yet, here was Ivica, standing in front of me completely fine, like nothing had happened. The adults in the village started to gather as word spread that something was wrong. Ivica's dad called over a few neighbors, and soon, a small group of men and women were standing around us, listening as we tried to explain what had happened. Some of them looked skeptical, but most of them just seemed concerned. They knew us. We had grown up here, spending every summer in this village. No one thought we were making it up, but no one could explain it either. After a quick discussion, the adults decided to go up the mountain to check for themselves. There was still a chance, they reasoned, that someone else had fallen. Maybe another child or a tourist. Maybe we had seen something and mistaken it for Ivica, though I couldn't understand how that would be possible. They asked Ivica to stay behind with his mother, while the rest of us headed back up the trail with the search party. As we retraced our steps up the mountain, I felt a pit growing in my stomach. The fear that had gripped me before had turned into something else. Something darker, more unsettling. I kept glancing at my friends, trying to read their faces. They looked just as confused and scared as I felt. None of us had any explanation for what had happened. We reached the part of the trail with the ravine, the place where Ivica had fallen, or where we thought he had fallen. I could still picture it in my mind so clearly, his body tumbling down the side, his scream ripping through the air. But now, standing there again with the adults around us, the cliffside looked empty. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No blood, no torn clothes, no sign of a body. The adults carefully searched the area, calling out, but there was no response. They climbed down into the ravine, looking under the boulders, scouring every corner. But there was nothing. No one. After what felt like hours, they climbed back up, shaking their heads. Nothing had happened. As we walked back down the mountain, I kept running it through my mind, over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling of unreality, like the world had flipped upside down. We had all seen the same thing. We had all heard that scream. And yet, Ivica was fine. There was no body, no evidence, nothing that made sense. When we got back to the village, Ivica was waiting for us sitting on his porch with his mom, still looking confused but no worse for wear. As I looked at him, something inside me shifted. Even though he was alive and standing right in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had lost him that day. That the Ivica we had seen fall was somehow still out there, trapped in that moment. The village eventually went back to normal. People stopped talking about it after a few days, and life moved on. But for the four of us who had been there, it never went away. We couldn't explain it, and we couldn't forget it. Every time I saw Ivica after that, a part of me wondered if it had really been him that we saw that day, or something else entirely.